Everything's
Nice
saved.
meeting you guys. Bye.
Yeah. Thanks again, Cameron.
Thanks.
Okay, let me just share my screen for a second. There we go. All right, I'm going to start bringing people in.
All right.
Hi, welcome everyone to the Fighting Tyranny Book Club's first meetup event. This is a cozy little conversation with two people from our club. And I just wanted to really quickly show everyone Kim Scott and David Troy's wonderful club, the Fighting Tyranny Book Club, where you can join them to read books that help us make sense of what the Russians are doing in Ukraine right now. We're reading The Future is History by Masha Gessen at the moment. And you can see tons and tons of conversation, hundreds of comments from people all around the world reading this book with us. Here's just a few of the comments from chapter 3, where people were speaking. We invite everyone that joins us tonight to join us in the Fighting Tyranny Book Club. And now I'm going to stop sharing my screen and introduce our guests for the night. And I'll just pull this up. And so first of all, a big welcome to everyone from the Fighting Tyranny Book Club, and a big welcome to Kim Scott and David Troy. My name is Jason Boog. I'm part of the editorial team here at Fable. I'm a lifelong reader, and I have learned so much since we began reading this book together this last month. It really is helping me make sense of what's going on in Ukraine right now. If you haven't already, please join and start reading and discussing with us. I'll drop the link in here a little bit later. On the Fable app, we can share annotations, start conversations right inside of the book. I'm so honored to welcome our two incredible book club moderators today. I'm going to start with Kim Scott. Kim is the author of Just Work, How to Root Out Bias, Prejudice, and Bullying to Build a Kick-Ass Culture of Inclusivity, and Radical Candor, Be a Kick-Ass Boss Without Losing Your Humanity. I have read both of those books, highly recommend them. She brings experience as CEO coach at Dropbox, Qualtrics, Twitter, and other tech companies. She also served as a faculty member at Apple University and led AdSense, YouTube, and DoubleClick teams at Google. So thank you so much for joining us today, Kim. And I'd also like to introduce David Troy, who's a researcher, technologist, investor interested in hybrid warfare and threats to democracy. He writes the Situation Report newsletter about bigger themes behind the news, does frequent public speaking, and hosts the Dave Troy Presents podcast, where he researches and explores the history behind current events. I'm beyond excited to be joined by both these guests today and this opportunity to discuss a very important book, The Future is History by Masha Gessen. So Kim, I'm going to open up by turning to you. You introduced me to this book, so I'd love to know, how did you discover this book, and why do you recommend people read it right now?
The second question is much easier to answer than the first. I don't know how people discover my books, and I don't know how I discover books. But what I do know is that I began my career actually in Moscow, starting up a diamond cutting factory of all things in 1990 in Moscow. And when the invasion of Ukraine happened, I started thinking, I have lost one of the things that I write about is the fact that my first management experience came from working with these Russian diamond cutters, and what they wanted to know was, would I help them get out if things went sideways in Russia? And now, of course, I had lost touch with them, and I realized I had just lost touch with all things Russian since I left in 1994. And Masha Gessen is a writer who I admire enormously, and I decided I would start with their book. And I recommend this book because it is such a great way to understand kind of what happened after the collapse of the Soviet Union through what I consider to my favorite way to read is to read about big ideas and about history through the lens of specific lives. And this book does that incredibly well from my perspective. But I'd love to hear Dave's thoughts on the book and why you were excited to read it with us.
Yeah, so I've been studying social media data for like the last 15 years, trying to understand how people, sort of form into communities online and what that means and what we can learn by studying that kind of data. And that really dragged me very much into the realm of disinformation, trying to understand disinformation campaigns, attempts to manipulate societies, and that kind of thing. So I started working on that quite deeply around 2015, 2016, and understanding what was going on with various kinds of information manipulation around the world. So that has led me into the study of this whole arc, certainly over the last 5 or 6 years, sort of in real time. But then, in order to understand the last 5 or 6 years, it's really necessary to go back and understand a lot of 20th century history in some really deep detail. So, what I've been trying to do over the last, couple 3 years in particular, is to contextualize a lot of what we're going through now in the West and what Russia's doing with, some of this back study of going back to, the Bolshevik Revolution and to the New Deal and to, the rise and fall of the Soviet Union. And so this book obviously speaks to all of that and was extremely relevant. And when I met up with Kim a few weeks ago at a conference, we were talking about our shared concerns about totalitarianism and authoritarianism, and how we would like to maybe team up to bring others into this conversation and really address these issues. So I think this book, by Masha Gessen, is a really great starting point for people that might be coming to this material fresh and wanting to get a good big picture understanding.
One of my favorite things about this club is how both of you have been pointing out these just really, some of them are very frightening parallels between America in 2022 and the picture we see of Russia in after the fall of the Soviet Union. So I would like to just discuss those a little bit and get your thoughts. Maybe I can throw it back to Kim first, but then David, I'd also like to hear your thoughts on that. I think it's very haunting, that aspect of this book.
Yeah, it really is haunting and frankly terrifying as you read it. The the way that people were treated in the Soviet Union, I mean, one of the things that really struck me when I lived, when I got to Russia in 1990, it was the Soviet Union, and when I left in 94, it was Russia, was the extent to which people were afraid to look at one another in public. There was such a palpable fear of one another and mistrust of one another at a social level. And I remember at one point I was at a party and I was wearing all clothes that I had bought in Russia, which was saying something because it was hard to find anything to buy. But anyway, I was not wearing my Levi's. And someone walked up to me and said, "Oh, you must be the American." And I said, "How do you know that I'm the American?" And they said, "Your eyes are so untroubled." And it was so, it stabbed me in the heart. And I see this happening here where we begin to mistrust one another, where a friend of mine was telling me about being at dinner with her children and her mother accused her children, who were 9 years old, of being liberal fascists. And the way, I mean, obviously the things, what Stalin did, we're nowhere near that. But I think we're moving more quickly than I ever thought I would see in my lifetime in that direction in this country, with some of the laws where you report that your Lyft driver or Uber driver reports on you if you're going to get an abortion. That kind of sowing that social mistrust is really frightening to me. And having lived and seen what happens in a society where that's occurring is something that I've been thinking sort of obsessively about. I think also, just in the course of my work on basic management, the problem of power and unchecked power is something that worries me a little bit in companies, and worries me a lot when our systems of checks and balances in this country seem to be failing us.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, certainly I observed, I've been to Russia. I was in Russia in late 2012 and observed some of the things that are actually remarked upon in the book. But the thing that really has been chilling to me is that, as we saw, what people were calling, Russian interference in the U.S. and the West and whatnot in 2015 and 2016, it became clear to me that it was in preparation for a broader conflict. And it became clear to me also that it seemed to be being driven by, this Duginist ideology. And so in like early 2017, I started basically sounding the, warning alarm, like, alert, alert. This Duginist ideology, if left sort of unmonitored, is going to lead us to some really dark places. We need to start taking action right now. And what I believe that we're seeing is, we saw how the Duginist ideology, kind of played out in Russia in terms of establishing Russia's idea of itself, as well as its ideas about what its relationship with Ukraine and the West is. And, also sparking a great deal of internal division using political technology to divide people against themselves. And those same exact approaches, most of which were developed by Dugin and his peers and others working with him, have been applied to the United States now and are being applied to the West generally. And all during that time, there was an effort, I think, by sort of the intelligentsia to, play down the idea that Dugin had any influence because he's so crazy. And on the one hand, yeah, sure, he's kind of crazy. On the other hand, it now is clear that the blueprint that he was putting together was what was being followed. And now we're dealing with the aftermath of, this war in Ukraine and however that's going to play out. But that's following his design. So now we have to reconcile, okay, well, what does that mean for the West? If that design was in fact what was going to happen, what's going to happen next based on that design?
And I think it might be good for folks, Dave, to sort of, for folks who don't know who Dugin is and what his ideology is, might be worth summarizing it, because like I thought I knew a lot, and I knew nothing. I realized as I was reading this book about Dugin. I had vague ideas, but
yeah, I mean, I think, it's good to kind of adopt the stance of being a perpetual student with this stuff, because it's kind of just very deep and there's a lot of different influences there. But basically, to make a very long and complicated story short, Dugin has this sort of hodgepodge philosophy that he's pulled together from a variety of predecessors. There's people like Ivan Ilyin, who was a philosopher who was exiled in 1922. Who had kind of ideas about Russia's imperial destiny and all of this. There's René Guénon, who's a French philosopher who had, kind of, I would say, retrograde ideas about where the West should go. Very much rooted in traditionalism. There's also H.J. Mackinder, who's an influence on Dugin, who describes two different styles of civilization. There's like thalassocracy, which is like civilizations that are oriented to the sea, versus tellurocracy, which is civilizations that are oriented towards land. And he makes the argument that these land-based civilizations are like morally superior to the sea-based ones, because presumably the sea-based civilizations are filled with seaports and loose women and things getting weird, not traditional enough. So it's a hodgepodge philosophy. He's a self-taught guy. He basically taught himself all these philosophers like Heidegger and Schopenhauer by like translating the works from German into Russian. He doesn't really have like strong academic credentials, but he's incredibly well read. But he's created this kind of fusion philosophy. There's also Francis Parker Yockey, who had a book called Imperium in 1947. Is very similar to his philosophy, and he's just created this like kind of mixed up fusion of different ideas that really just amount to basically being very pro-traditionalist, anti-progressive, anti-the West, and trying to preserve, I guess, what you might call a distinct Russian cultural identity.
Yeah, it's sort of like Russian colonialism, almost like a justification, a rationalization.
Well, I think he sort of sees like there's a natural bound for Russia's ambitions. And because Russia is so large and it happens to span Europe and Asia, he basically wants to have a Russian sphere that runs from like Greece to Japan,
Yeah,
with a couple of asterisks.
yeah.
So that's kind of the big picture.
God, thank you for that. And that's, like I said earlier, that's the beauty of this club, is the links, the things that I can explore and learn more about this as I'm reading. And I really appreciate that. Kim, one thing that you and I, when we first started talking about this book, one thing that's really stuck with me is just this rising tide of book banning in America. People that are focusing on critical race theory and books with LGBTQ plus themes. We're seeing this in America, and then we see how much that is part of the playbook that was being used in Russia, especially towards the end of this book. It was really, I still get goosebumps like reading some of that. Like the language people use is almost exactly the same, and here we are, these people that love books, and so I just love to hear more about that from your point of view.
Yeah, I mean the book banning is like who thought that American Nobel Prize writers would be banned? And like it's incomprehensible to me that Toni Morrison, one of the great writers of all time, and certainly one of the writers who I love and who I got to take a class with in college, like it's shocking to me, and yet it felt when I remember when I was living in what was then the Soviet Union, being shocked about the laws against homosexuality that were still in place and that even got worse. Like somehow I expected when the Soviet Union collapsed that would get better, but we saw it get worse, and it makes me wonder, like who is it American? Is it the American homophobes that are influencing the Russians, or the Russians who are influencing the Americans?
Goes
Like,
both ways.
yeah, yeah. But it's also one of the things that makes me, one of the things that I've been thinking about, and one of the reasons why I wanted to do this book club with folks is that there's a quote from a speech that Martin Luther King gave in St. Louis about how there's he calls them the children of darkness are so much more zealous and organized than the children of light. Like, I think as progressives, we need to get organized. I think very much we have this sort of live and let live philosophy, but that's not what's happening in the world. And if we want to live and let live, we got to get organized together. We've got to build solidarity and protect one another, because there are folks around the world who are organizing to attack folks.
Yeah, and I would view the book banning, as well as the anti-homosexuality kind of zealotry, through the lens of traditionalism, and using traditionalism as a way to motivate people towards national unity and taking action that fulfills the wishes of the people that are trying to drive these things. So it's not so much necessarily like they're necessarily totally ideologically committed to some of these things. They're using it as a cultural instrument to some extent. So, I think that's something important to kind of keep in mind, in that, anytime we see these kinds of, attacks on people's rights or on books or whatever, it's usually an effort to rally people around a kind of cultural direction. And one of the things that I found fascinating, I was reading another book called Black 100 about really the rise of religious zealotry in the 20th century in Russia. And it made the point that by about 1955, Marxist Leninist rhetoric did nothing to stir the popular imagination. You couldn't build movements around that because everybody was cynical about it and no one really cared. And it didn't really it was never really all that popular to begin with. It was only sort of through a series of accidents of history that movement became the sort of victorious one in the 1917, 1922 timeframe. So, it became clear they needed to use other kinds of things to motivate people. So they started using, religion, and they started using nationalism and the Russian identity and Russian language as ways to get people unified and excited about doing stuff. And so all of like the space race and all that was all built on Russian nationalism and sort of zeal for what it meant to be Russian, more than it was built around Marxist Leninist dogma. So anyway, I think that strain of thought became kind of metastasized in the 90s when the Soviet Union went away. Those forces became very much ascendant.
Yeah, and I think also um, it wasn't it's not only Russian nationalism, but it's this particular sense of grievance, this sense of inferiority or superiority that feels very familiar now here in the U.S. as well. This feeling of having lost a former greatness
Mm-hmm.
was something that was always striking to me about that kind of Russian or Soviet rhetoric, and also the skepticism about doing the right thing, which also feels now very familiar to the way that sort of zealously conservative American thought goes. So, for example, at one point I was with a group of Russians, and we had a picnic, and I was picking up the trash, and they mocked me for being a pioneer, and it was striking. It was like, I'm just picking up the trash. That's the right thing to do, you know.
That's a certain kind of cynicism, yeah.
Yes, it is. That feels familiar.
The concept, and if anyone is interested in finding some key Dugin passages in the book, the Homo Civiticus chapter, which I believe is chapter 4, has a lot of his thoughts there. You can see kind of how his philosophy comes together there. But you both responded to Masha Gessen's descriptions of Homo Civiticus and started to imagine what Homo Americanus would look like or does look like now. So I'd love to hear both of your thoughts on that, and what can we do to start preventing that really fascist worldview from developing here. So I open that question to both of you.
You want to take a swing first, Kim, or
Sure.
you want me to go first?
Why don't you go first?
Well, I started thinking about that, the idea of what does constitute, Homo Americanus at this point, and what should it be? What would we hope that it could be? And I think that, what is kind of very prominent with this book is that, the way to control a culture, the way to conquer a culture, isn't so much to engage in kinetic conflict first. It's really about setting up the information environment in a way that creates the kind of creature that is responsive in the way you want them to be to what your goals are, right? So I feel like that as much as this book identifies that this Homo Sovieticus existed during the Soviet Union and it never really went away with the fall of the Soviet Union, and thus perpetuated many of the ideas and cynicism and institutions that had been present in the Soviet Union well into the future. I think that there's an effort right now to make Homo Americanus overwhelmed very much with information so that you can't do sense making, more cynical, less willing to participate in institutions, to fight institutions. I mean, there's a whole undercurrent right now with, a whole lot of anti-institutional trends, including things like cryptocurrencies, which are fundamentally anti-institutional in their nature. And so, what I think that there's a bit of an effort to do is to reform the American idea of what it means to be an American, to be much more individual and less tied to cultural identity, less tied to a shared cultural identity. There's bringing out this idea of individualism, American exceptionalism. I think is really key to what's kind of going on right now. And the hope is, I think, from the people that are driving this, that within a generation, we'll have a bunch of people that just simply don't want to participate in shared national institutions, willing to maybe do things on the state and local level, but the whole goal with this is to make the federal government go away. So
Yeah.
if you're trying to make a person that wants the federal government to go away.
Yeah, and it's ironic because in many ways, Homo Sovieticus was formed around making the national government, creating a totalitarian state. It's funny that they meet but I think that the commonalities are one, despair. You make people feel a sense of despair that they have any agency over anything really. And it's partly, I think you're right, it's information, but it's also economic. The despair, and you see this in this country as well as we saw it especially in the Soviet Union, but also now. There was a despair that you could improve your circumstances economically or sort of intellectually. And I think that's what's really dangerous. Well, there's a lot of things that are dangerous, but that feeling of despair and creating a sense of despair is really alarming. And it's interesting how it's done differently in the Soviet Union than in the US, but a lot of similarities.
Since we're on the topic of economics, one thing that Kim pointed out in the discussion was that the Russian oligarchs have almost a greater percentage of that country's wealth as the top 1% in the USA. What sort of environment does when we have this economic disparity, and I think that's probably where some of that despair comes from, but I'd love to hear, David, maybe you first. What is that? How does that affect the Homo Americanus, that inequality that's so clear at this moment in history?
Yeah, I mean, so I just got done writing a big historical piece covering 1933 to the present, all about how basically the reaction to the New Deal is animating a lot of what's happening right now. And so I feel like that, that reaction basically of the elites, rich people, they didn't like what was going on with the New Deal. They didn't want to pay for it. They started to kind of become very reactionary in their desires and to really push back the New Deal. So they kind of spent 40 years sort of griping and grousing about the New Deal, and then they got organized around 1970 to 1980. They started figuring out how to do this, and now we're living in the world where they're actually being pretty successful at rolling back a lot of the New Deal kind of things. So I feel like that wealth inequality is a product of them becoming more and more successful at rolling back taxes, of putting in various kinds of rolling back regulations, putting in people favorable to their cause in the courts, just really trying to make the whole Powell Memorandum that came out in 1971 was really, put in mind to make government more business friendly. So, we're living in that business friendly world right now. And so, what does that do? That enriches, Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk and all the other rich people. And I think people are, increasingly cynical about that. I think they're resentful of it, and I mean, I'm not one of these like extreme people that's like, tax all the billionaires, blah, 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 or burn it all down. I think it's more like we should never have let it get this far out of hand to begin with. And sure, be rich, but also pay your share. And I think that there's just a lot of cynicism that people have about, people that they don't perceive as paying their share. And then also, there's people that are willing to use that cynicism towards a variety of political ends, including to continue to burn it down. So, this could get a lot worse before it gets better if we don't get a better handle on kind of what's going on. And as Kim said, organize to fight back against some of this in a very much more coherent way.
I think also our economy, I would characterize it right now, it's not business friendly, it's wealthy person friendly. And there's a big difference. Like right now, I think the way that so much of private equity works is to bleed these businesses, not feed them, not build businesses, but strip their assets and flip them, strip and flip. And that is exactly what the Russian oligarchs did with the businesses that they were given. It was not business friendly. It was individual wealthy person friendly. And I think also in the Soviet Union, it was taking assets and giving them to individuals, even in the Soviet Union, to bureaucrats, not to and that was a drain on the economy in the same way that the way that our economy is working right now is it's like a snake eating its tail. It's in the end it's self-destructive, but it's going to take us all down with it. Another book that this book made me think of, sort of thinking about individual versus collective, was The Worst Hard Time. Like the myth of American individualism is really a dangerous one. We have to have some collective goals. Otherwise, we get this get richer algorithm.
Yeah, I would just also very briefly add that, this idea of American individualism isn't just sort of wrong and silly. It's also, actively destructive, because what it tends to have us do is to discount the value of social relationships and social connections in solving problems and getting real things done. And at the end of the day, the human species, operates both as individuals, but also in a collective sense. And if you're not accounting for the value of social capital, you'll get all your solutions wrong.
Yeah.
It's just like leaving a key thing out of a math equation. You can't do it.
Yeah. And I would say the one thing that we're better at than any other animal is collaboration, is working together.
Because of language and,
yes.
Our abilities to coordinate and organize that way. So,
yeah.
One thing that and please, if anyone in the club who's watching right now has any questions, this is the moment to give them. We'll be moving on shortly. But one thing that has come up in the club over and over are people finding parallels to even like our own kind of looming recession here. And I think it was Kim who mentioned just even like both of you actually mentioned it, looming shortages that are coming, and we saw how Russia responded to shortages, how that left an effect on the entire generation. So now, as we are looking ahead to, it looks like some hard times are coming, we're going to have to buckle up. Like, how do you have any thoughts and maybe even advice as we move into this much more difficult period for the readers? I know it comes up a lot in club conversations.
You want to start, Kim? Or?
Yeah, I mean, when I moved to Moscow in 1990, I'll never forget walking into a grocery store and there was nothing there. It's not like the shelves were, there was some gaps. There was nothing. There was nothing in the grocery store. And that is a supply chain problem. We have not really experienced supply chain problems. The thing that I learned there was that people are pretty resourceful, and they learned how to collaborate in ways. Like if you wanted to buy vodka, you hailed a cab. And because the taxi cabs would see the vodka for sale first, they'd buy it up. It was in the trunk of all the cars. And one of the problems became in a world of shortages became that you had to have, for example, a good relationship with your butcher in order to get meat. You couldn't just go buy meat. And it sort of made me appreciate the value of a transaction. Like we want relationships where we need relationships, but we also want a functioning, we don't want to have to figure all this stuff out. And so I would say that the other thing that happened in times of shortages is that people would hoard. And so I remember there were, and we saw this with toilet paper here during COVID, but but they needed bread would disappear from Moscow. You couldn't buy bread anywhere in Moscow from time to time, and like in 19 like so much for the evil empire, like they couldn't get bread. But they estimated that when a shortage began, they had to make 20 times more bread than the city could eat in order to prevent people from hoarding. And so I think a little bit of a little bit of sort of being willing to consider things like, you know, holding back, not is going to be important, and it's not something we're good at doing in this country.
Yeah, I mean, I think, where we're kind of at right now is, first off, a healthy percentage of the population in this country doesn't see this conflict in Ukraine, certainly, as having anything at all to do with their daily lives or existence. That's probably, 60-70% of people just think it's something happening somewhere else and irrelevant. There's another chunk of people that are concerned about it, and then there's other people that are ready for like civil war. So I mean, you have a spectrum of responses. I guess my feeling is that, most Americans, certainly my generation and younger, and, my parents' generation, I think, was maybe the last generation really to face significant deprivation and hardship and sacrifice as a result of global conflict or economic, hardship. And I just think people need to be prepared for, food to be really expensive, for fuel to be really expensive, to make sacrifices, to kind of draw on character and resilience to survive what could be a very ugly period of time, and something that Americans, because of American exceptionalism, because of American individualism, we have kind of convinced ourselves that like we don't have to do stuff like that. And I just am not sure that's true. And I also would hesitate to encourage anybody to become paranoid or to overreact to this situation. I think hoarding is a significant issue. I don't think that like the prepper mentality is the right one to bring to this. I think it's more of a communitarian self-reliance kind of philosophy. Be ready to plant a garden and to enjoy doing that, and to take each day as it comes. Hoarding a bunch of resources or digging a bunker or buying guns or whatever, like, no, I don't think that's the proper mental response to this stuff. I know there's people that want people to do that, but I think that's counterproductive. So yeah, I think, we may be called on to draw on our character and our greatness that, we have within, if we can find it. And hopefully, it will go in a way that's not too, ugly, and not too violent or anything like that. But people should be prepared for some hard times.
I think also think about the people in your life who may be struggling, who may be more vulnerable to struggling if food prices, for example, go up, and think about how you can help those people. I think we don't do a great job in this country with abstractions, but I think we do often do a pretty good job doing the right thing by people who we know. So think about the people you know and how you can help them if food prices, for example, go up, or if shortages go to, emerge.
Yeah, agreed.
It's really beautiful. I wanted to just read one quote that Kim wrote in the club. It's really stuck with me. Turns out that we need collaboration to survive, and that collaboration is our superpower. And I think if there is a theme that's emerged from this conversation, that's it for me. And I think Kim just gave us some really good advice for how to find that spirit of collaboration in our lives. But David, I'd also like to hear if you had any thoughts about that, especially since it's the disinformation that you study that's fractured that sense of collaboration. And sometimes it feels hard to tap back into that after the last few years that we've had of really a lot of anger and separation.
Yeah, I mean, this is a continuous journey of learning and trying to understand how things work and what's going on. But the way that I've come to understand kind of the disinformation problem is through the lens of information warfare. So information warfare being something that precedes kinetic warfare, being a preparatory step that makes it possible for kinetic warfare to be successful. And so if you actually look at what information warfare does in terms of its function, what it tends to do is to sever ties between people. It tends to deplete social capital. So to the extent that you have a healthy social network that with a lot of different relations that are cross-cutting and overlapping and messy and interesting, what information warfare tends to want to do is to cut those ties, to break people up and atomize them, and to be against each other, to hate, to have multiple different groups that all hate each other. And that erodes our social fabric. It erodes our capability to be resilient. So I think all of us need to start to think about the idea of disinformation as not being just some disembodied thing that like exists online and like, oh, that's not true. No, you're being targeted with warfare. And what are the effects of that warfare? So how do you fight that? And a lot of the people that I've talked to about this, in terms of asking them, what they think an effective response is, they talk about working together at the local level, because at the end of the day, it's those of us living and working and breathing in the same communities that can recreate, this like messy, kind of complicated social structure that's needed to keep us together. So, and I'm also struck by every time I'm out in the world, in like real world communities, which, gosh, we haven't been doing that much these days. People are so much kinder and nicer to each other than they are online, and that's because we have to look each other in the eye. We have to interact with each other. We have to transact with each other. We have to get along. And for the most part, we're just not as awful in person as we are online. So get offline, go spend time with real people, make new relationships and get back out there. I think, this COVID thing has been just the worst in terms of helping this information warfare to advance even further, and we should try to counteract those effects.
Yeah, I think that's so important. I was giving a talk recently, and I hadn't realized when I agreed to do the talk that I was going in to give a talk to an extremely conservative group, and I think they didn't quite realize who I was either. But anyway, I said, well, let's do it. Maybe it'll be interesting. Sure. And I remember standing up in front of this group and thinking, these people are not my enemies. Like, how did I get into the... And a woman who was in the audience came up to me afterwards, and she asked me about various beliefs I have. And, where we were on opposite sides of guns, abortion, a number of other topics. And she looked at me and she said, you really don't seem like an evil person. And I said, no, let's try. So I think the more conversations like that we can have where we remind one another of our shared humanity, the better.
Yeah, and just studying disinformation in the communities that produce them, people get it so in their heads that like this is about intelligence or education or whatever. And I'm telling you, a lot of people that are sort of on what we would call maybe the wrong side, they're not dumb, they're not uneducated, they just have very different worldviews, and they're which have their own foibles, so.
Yeah, I think our attitude towards intelligence is deserves some scrutiny.
Absolutely.
Right. Well, thank you. I think that's a really good place to end things now. Thank you for those closing thoughts. I've shared links to both Kim and David's work online. Please learn more about them and keep reading with us. We're about to switch books. That'll be a very exciting day. There's some really good books on deck here, so I'm really looking forward to that. Thank you so much, David. Thank you so much, Kim. And thank you for everyone who will be watching this later. We will be sharing this recording widely with everyone else. So thank you, and thank you for sharing your insight today, David and Kim.
Thank you all very much. I love reading along with all of you. I feel a little more optimistic about the future.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun seeing everybody's comments. So thanks again.
Okay, bye.